The Third Missionary Journey, Lesson 10, September 1 to 7, Sabbath afternoon. Memory text. I do not count my life of any value to myself, if only I may finish my course and the minutes that I received from the Lord Jesus to testify to the good news of God's grace. Acts chapter 20, verse 24. Luke's account of Paul's third journey starts rather abruptly. The text says only that after spending some time in Antioch, the center of Paul's mission, the apostle set out on another journey, passing successively through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Acts chapter 18, verse 23. So the first 1,500 miles of the journey are covered in one sentence. This is because the focal point of the journey was Ephesus, where Paul spent more time than in any other city in the course of his journeys. From the evangelistic standpoint, the ministry in Ephesus was very fruitful. The impact of Paul's preaching reached the holy province of Asia. It was probably during this time that the churches of Colossae and Hierapolis and Laodicea were founded, perhaps through Epaphras, one of Paul's co-workers. A remarkable thing about this journey is that it is the last one of Paul's recorded in Acts. Paul undertook it as a free man. Luke records yet another journey, this time to Rome, but as a prisoner. Ephesus, Sunday, September 2, Part 1. Acts 18:24-28 records that while Paul was still on his way to Ephesus, a Jewish believer named Apollos came to the city. He was an eloquent man and well-versed in the scriptures. That Apollos was a follower of Jesus is clear from the way Luke describes him. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately. Yet he knew only John's baptism. Having been baptized by John the Baptist, Apollos became acquainted with Jesus during Jesus' earthly life, but he must have moved away from the area, probably back to Alejandria, before the Passion Pentecost events. This explains why Aquila and Priscilla would give him further instructions. Though being able to show from the scripture that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel, Apollos needed to be updated as to the developments of Christianity since Jesus' ministry. However, Aquila and Priscilla did more for Apollos. With the other believers in Ephesus, they gave him a recommendation letter addressed to the church in Achaia, which allowed him to have an effective ministry in Corinth. Read Acts chapter 19, verse 1 to 7. What happened to Paul when he arrived in Ephesus? Apollos' story is connected to the account of the 12 men Paul met in Ephesus upon his arrival in that city, because their situation was very similar. Their description as disciples, and Paul's question to them clearly indicate that they were already believers in Jesus. At the same time, their answer to Paul shows that, similar to Apollos, they were former disciples of John the Baptist, who had become followers of Jesus without having experienced Pentecost. They were to have an opportunity to enjoy a deeper experience with the Lord. On his arrival at Ephesus, Paul found 12 brethren, who, like Apollos, had been disciples of John the Baptist, and like him, had gained some knowledge of the mission of Christ. They had not the ability of Apollos, but with the same sincerity and faith, they were seeking to spread abroad the knowledge they had received. Ellen G. White, The Acts of the Apostles, page 282. We should view their new baptism in light of this unique situation. They were not coming from another Christian denomination, nor were they experiencing conversion. They were only being integrated into mainstream Christianity. That they received the Spirit and spoke in tongues probably means they, like Apollos, were Christian missionaries who now were being empowered fully to witness about Jesus Christ wherever they went. Ephesus, Monday, September 3, Part 2. In Ephesus, Paul followed his practice of preaching in the synagogue first. When opposition arose, he and the new believers moved to the lecture hall of a certain Tyrannus, where Paul preached daily for 2 years. Luke's summary of Paul's Ephesian ministry is that the entire province was intensely evangelized. In Acts chapter 19, verse 11 to 20, Luke adds a few miracle stories describing the triumph of God's power in a city where magic and other superstition practices were rather common. There is no doubt that God could heal through Paul, but that even handkerchiefs and aprons touched by the apostle had healing power may sound strange to some, though this bears resemblance to Jesus' healing of the woman with the hemorrhage. The Ephesian superstitious belief may have led God to perform extraordinary miracles, as Luke says. This is perhaps an example of God's meeting the need of the people at their own level of understanding. Satisfied with the result of his mission in Ephesus, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem. Luke does not give a reason for this trip, but we know from Paul's own writings that he wished to deliver the funds he had collected to relieve the poverty of the Jerusalem church. The pooling of goods of the first years in a severe famine in the days of Claudius impoverished the Judean believer, and Paul saw in their appeal for help an opportunity to strengthen both their trust in his apostleship and the unity of a now transcultural church, despite knowing the risk to which he would be exposed. Read Acts chapter 19, verse 23 to 41. What was the real reason for the opposition to Paul that arose in Ephesus at the end of his stay there? The opposition had to do with pagan worship, which severely was threatened by Paul's ministry. Demetrius' real motivation was clearly financial, but he was able to turn it into a religion matter because the temple of Artemis or Diana, reckoned as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was located in Ephesus. Read Acts 19:27. Notice how artfully Demetrius was able to bring in religion's piety in his attempt to keep the money flowing in. Why must we as a Christian be careful not to use our faith or a pretended piety in regard to our faith in the same way? Troas, Tuesday, September 4. After the riot, Paul resolved to leave Ephesus, but he took an extended detour through Macedonia and Achaia instead of going straight to Jerusalem. On this journey, representatives of some Gentile church were with him. Read Acts chapter 20, verse 7 to 12. What's wrong with the common argument that this verse helped prove the Sabbath was changed to Sunday? Paul stopped over in Troas and ended with a church meeting on the first day of the week. They gathered together to break bread, which probably refers to the Lord's Supper, with or without the fellowship meal that often was combined with it since the early days of the Jerusalem church. That there is no mention of a cup nor any prayer does not rule out this possibility. The point, however, is that this episode often is mentioned as an evidence that in Paul's time, at least Gentile church already had replaced Sabbath with Sunday as a day of worship. Yet, before making such a claim, it is necessary to establish the precise day on which the meeting took place, as well as the nature of the meeting, the reference to the use of lights, together with the fact that Paul's message continued until midnight, and then until daybreak, not to mention the deep sleep of Eutychus, make it clear it was a night meeting. The question though is whether it was the night before Sunday or the night after Sunday. The answer depends on what system of time reckoning Luke is using, whether the Jewish system from sundown to sundown or the Roman one from midnight to midnight. If it is the former, then it was Saturday night. In case of the latter, it was Sunday night. Either way, the context of Acts chapter 20, verse 7 to 12 indicates that even if the meeting was on Sunday night, it was not a regular church meeting, but a special one due to Paul's departure the following morning. It is hard to see then how this isolated and exceptional episode affords support for Sunday keeping. The fact is, it doesn't. Draw more on all the reason for the validity of keeping the 7-day Sabbath. How does the power biblical support for the Sabbath help affirm us in our identity as a 7-day Adventist Christians and the calling that we have been given to spread the three angels' message to the world? Miletus, Wednesday, September 5. On his way to Jerusalem, Paul made another stop, this time at Miletus, where he had the opportunity to convey his farewell address to the Ephesian church leaders. Read Acts chapter 20, verse 15 to 27. What was Paul's emphasis in the introductory part of his speech? Since he already had made plans for a new journey, which included Rome and Spain, Paul believed that he would never return to Asia, so he started his speech with a kind of accountability report of the year spent in Ephesus. Such a report, however, aimed not only at the past, that is, the way he had lived among the Ephesians, but also at the future, for he feared what could happen to him in Jerusalem. Paul's fear was not unfounded. The Jerusalem church viewed him with some skepticism, if not hostility, due to his past as persecutor and the circumcision-free gospel he preached. To the Jewish authority, he was nothing but a traitor and apostate from the religion tradition. By mid-1st century, especially on account of Roman misrule, Judea also was gripped by revolutionary and nationalist ideals. This atmosphere influenced all segments of Jewish society, including possibly the church. In such a context, the activities of the former Pharisee among the Gentiles must have made him a figure of notoriety. Paul also had more concerns. In Acts chapter 20, verse 28 to 31, Paul focused on how the church leader in Ephesus should handle the subject of false teachers, whom he compared to savage wolves who would try to misguide and pervert the flock. So, even in the church itself and even in the earliest days of the church, the danger of false teacher was real. As Solomon said in another time and another context, there is nothing new under the sun. A history of the Christian church reveals the incredible damage that false teachers have brought to the church. The problem will exist until the end, too. No question, Paul had a lot of things on his mind, a lot of concerns, and yet his faithfulness and his diligence never wavered. Read 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8 to 14. What is Paul saying here that we need to apply to ourselves, especially when trials come? Where does Paul put his ultimate hope? Tyre and Caesarea, Thursday, September 6. After Miletus, Luke records Paul's journey in some detail. Still en route to Jerusalem, the apostles spent a week in Tyre, on the Phoenician coast, where the ship was to be unloaded. However, while he was there, the believer urged him not to go to Jerusalem. That the believers were led by the Spirit to warn Paul not to go to Jerusalem is not necessarily in contradiction to the apostles' earlier guidance. The Greek eteto and topinamati in Acts 19:21 likely should be rendered as resolved, purposed in the Spirit, rather than as if Paul had come to this decision all by himself. The point is that the Spirit may have shown the Tyrian Christians the danger that lay ahead of Paul, and so, out of human concern, they recommended that he not proceed with his intent. Paul himself was not sure about what would happen to him in Jerusalem. Divine guidance does not always make everything clear, even for someone like Paul. Read Acts 21, verse 10 to 14. What special incident took place in Caesarea concerning Paul's trip to Jerusalem? Agabus was a prophet from Jerusalem who had already been introduced in the famine episode in Acts 11, 27 to 30. In a way similar to some Old Testament prophecies, his message was an acted one. It functioned as a vivid illustration of what would happen to Paul when he arrived in Jerusalem and how his enemy would hand him over to the Gentiles, the Romans. Those who were with Paul apparently took Agabus' message as a warning, not as a prophecy, and so they tried by all means to convince the apostle he should not go up to Jerusalem. Though deeply touched by their reaction, Paul was determined to accomplish his mission, even at the cost of his own life. For him, the integrity of the gospel and the unity of the church were more important than his own personal safety or interests. Never before had the apostle approached Jerusalem with so sad a heart. He knew that he would find a few friends and many enemies. He was near the city which had rejected and slain the Son of God, and over which now hung the threatening of the divine right. And he wrote the Acts of Apostles, page 397-398. Misunderstood, malignant, mistreated, and often reviled, Paul nevertheless pressed on his faith. On in faith. How can we learn to do the same in discouraging circumstances? Further thought, Friday, September 7. The success attending the preach of the gospel aroused the anger of the Jew anew. From every quarter were coming accounts of the spread of the new doctrine by which Jews were released from the observance of the rites of the ceremonial law, and Gentiles were admitted to equal privilege with the Jews as children of Abraham. Paul's, emphatic statement, "There is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision," was regarded by his enemies as daring blasphemy, and they determined that his voice should be silenced. And he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, page 390. And he could not count upon the sympathy and support of even his own brethren in the faith. The uncovered Jew, who had followed so closely upon his track, had not been slow to circulate the most unfavorable reports at Jerusalem, both personally and by letter, concerning him and his work, and some, even of the apostles and elders, had received these reports as truth, making no attempt to contradict them and manifesting no desire to harmonize with him. Page 398. Discussion questions. The 12 disciples Paul met in Ephesus were former followers of John the Baptist, who already had become disciples of Jesus. Why do you think that it is correct to use this passage to require rebaptism of Christians already baptized by immersion from other denomination who joined the Adventist faith? Is there any significance in the fact that Apollo was not rebaptized? Think about Paul's situation. He is rejected by his own countrymen who don't believe in Jesus. Even of the Jews who do believe in Jesus, many view Paul with great suspicion, even distrust, because they think he is perverting the landmarks Many of the pagans hate the gospel he's proclaiming, and yet what? Why did Paul press on, despite all this opposition? Though we are not Paul, what can we take away for ourselves from his story? Think about some of the other arguments that people use to try to prove either that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday or that is no longer binding. How do we answer those arguments and do it in a way to show that obedience to the Sabbath is no more legalism than is obedience to any of other 9 commandments? That is, if we obey by faith and with the understanding or of where our only hope of salvation lies.